Hello and welcome to GitLab Design Talks. We're specifically talking about collaboration today, and I'm here with Austin. My name is Nick. Austin, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a product designer here at GitLab. I joined the company about 6 months ago now. So I've gotten my taste of the all remote collaboration and excited to talk more about the topic.
Cool. So 6 months at GitLab. Tell me, what have you learned about collaboration so far?
I think it's worthwhile to talk about where I came from in terms of collaboration. So I used to work for a pretty large enterprise, like 150,000 employees. The IT department was much smaller, but my team was trying to mimic what the company or former company Pivotal did with their labs organization, where they would try and go in and help teams level up their product design, development, product management skill set. And it leaned very, very heavily on the in-person interaction to like teach the different agile rituals, design pairing, and so on and so forth. And so we tried to replicate that model within the company because we had like a very big organization that needed to digitally transform. And I think it's pretty clear we left a lot on the table by not leaning into all remote first.
Interesting. Tell me more of what you mean by that.
So from the company I was working at, a lot of teams were geographically dispersed. And so it created this tension where you might have like one developer in Washington or a couple developers in India or something per se. And you had the rest of the team that was co-located, kind of doing all these activities and stuff next to each other. And then there's this gap. There's this communication gap, this knowledge gap between different team members, and then extra energy has to be invested in keeping other people in the loop. So this is additional synchronous meetings. This was probably confusion within like Jira or GitLab, depending on the project that I was working on. This was probably more presentations to project managers who would then communicate it to executives and VPs. There was just a lot more requirement to push rather than to pull information.
Yeah. So yeah, two key aspects you're sort of talking about there. The communication aspect, so getting everyone on the same page, and then also the content aspect as well. So the creation, the sharing, the collaboration around content. So I suppose it would be interesting if you sort of expanded upon the differences you see in communication styles in an all remote company versus a physical company, and also the difference that you see in sharing of content styles as well.
Yeah, so I think there are two things in terms of like sharing content and communication as like a baseline. And it comes down to the technology first. So like, are the right technology tools available to the employees or team members that are working together? The company I was coming from was rather restrictive in that sense, which created a barrier. So, it took like a year just to get InVision. So it took a while to be able to remotely collaborate on designs. There wasn't really a method to do so other than sharing sketch files back and forth, which was fine. It was just a lot of emails and it was hard to keep up with what's the most recent thing or running into share server file constraints and having to get those things approved. So not having some of the easy design collaboration tools available made like sharing assets difficult. A lot of exporting, copy pasting, screenshots, all that stuff, which we still have to some extent in GitLab. It's not like we don't do those things. Like I'm still exporting stuff from Figma, putting it into a GitLab issue. The difference is it's a lot easier to just pull someone into a conversation in Figma now when we're like on a Zoom call. I don't have to like go send the file, wait for it to get there. And then the communication piece, at least here, we focus on trying to get all the communication within GitLab, and then Slack kind of becomes a secondary component. And then from there, it's even specifically in threading in different channels. And that lack of understanding of how to use the platform didn't exist in my last company. So we didn't have Slack, but we had Mattermost, that pretty similar competitor product. and it just like didn't click. The main team members there just wanted to use email and Skype messaging. So it created this tension of like, well, where do we talk to each other at? Whereas we have it like defined our handbook how everybody's going to work. But there it was kind of just up to whatever the team liked to do. And I think what you usually found was if the team members were more flexible on tool stack, they were open to trying things like Mattermost or communicating within GitLab. But then when it came to other teams, they're like, no, we just like email and Skype. And so that's how it's going to be. So there's that aspect of it. And then obviously there's the focus on synchronous in-person communication first. I think one of the unique challenges that we were coming up against was we had a lot of people that were trying to transfer domain sets. So we had project managers trying to learn how to become product managers. We had front-end engineers trying to learn how to become designers. Hell, I was even training a mechanical engineer how to be a designer because they were a team of 3 people and someone had to at least appreciate front end for them to get something done. And so that's partly what made it so difficult to appreciate asynchronous collaboration, was there just wasn't enough of a shared contextual understanding to just get running. We needed to like walk before we could even, crawl before we could even walk in the situation.
Yeah, don't knock engineers becoming designers, because that's that's how I got into it. Anyway,
no, that's great.
Yeah, so I agree with you. I think there's sort of one common theme that sort of goes across all the different topics that you're just talking about there, was sort of orthodoxy. So like deeply held beliefs on how things should be done. So I think there's a lot of hangover that you get from different disciplines, different functions within different companies, which are like, email is the default way that we communicate, because emails is how emails and meetings. I think the term that we had in my last job was imping, EEEMP, imping, email, meeting, PowerPoint. That's the modus. That's the modus operandi for how companies collaborated. And I think that's like a really, it's just something that a lot of teams, a lot of different individuals have held on to. And it's the orthodoxy, that deeply held belief that needs to be broken or reevaluated in order to approach remote collaboration. And I think remote collaboration, what you can't do is replace the activities that you do in like a physical face-to-face environment 1-for-1 with the remote 100%. Environment. You need to sort of approach it from first principles and think about, what is the key thing that we're trying to achieve? What's the job to be done that we're trying to do right here? And instead, how do we not replicate that, but how do we fulfill the same job in a remote environment? I think the one example that we use in our handbook is the whiteboard. Like there's no good replacement in the remote space for like a great whiteboard session that you have with 1 or 2 other people. However, if you think about, well, what does that whiteboarding session do? It helps you to, in a low fidelity way, get some ideas out and communicate some concepts in ways which are beyond just words. You can visualize stuff quite quickly. What does it help you to do? It helps you to sort of layer ideas on top of each other from different people. Right. So when you sort of approach it from that angle, from first principles and saying, this is what we're trying to achieve, then you think about, oh, well, we can actually potentially use Figma to get some ideas out. And then, so I suppose, have you noticed some of these patterns in yourself or orthodoxies in yourself of things that you assumed was like the only way of going about design, but instead they've been shifted? And also, have you noticed some things where you've tried to keep an open mind, but you still feel like there's some disadvantages to the remote working environment?
Yeah, so one of the most impactful things I noticed when coming to GitLab was everybody was leading by example in terms of how they were executing their designs. And maybe it was just the sheer volume of exposure I was getting to more designers and more ways of thinking helped me more critically look at my own work. Whereas because everybody was working in a co-located sense in my last company, you didn't get that exposure. So you were just kind of like working in your bubble until we got to like the UX showcase situation where it's like, oh, now people are showcasing their work, and you don't really see everything else that happens in between. So you're missing out on the little things like, how did this designer progress on this idea? How did they work with their product manager on figuring out what the right scope was? How did they go about testing with users and informing their design decisions that way? I can see how that's happening because everybody's kind of sharing that either through different forums and synchronous meetings or even asynchronously in our co-working channel or within issues. And so that's been really, really cool to see. I think the area that is difficult still for asynchronous work is working with junior designers or even newer people coming in where they don't have the skill set to know how to start working functionally in Figma right off the bat. Maybe they don't even understand basic design heuristics. They've talked about them a little bit at work, or sorry, at school or something. And they have a bunch of very easy to answer questions, but that could take a little bit longer to get around to asynchronously because it's not a priority to respond. So I saw a lot of growth in the novice designers that I was working with at my last company because we're going from zero to like functional pretty quickly, at least where they could even work in this type of environment. But I think it might be a challenge to see someone come in with very minimal knowledge at all of the domain and then try and get them functional without having a dedicated peer to work alongside them. But I'm interested to see what you think about that.
I agree. Yeah, I think having more junior designers come in and learn the craft of design in an all remote context is actually quite a challenging thing.
Yeah.
And what I feel, or why I feel that is, there's often two types of learning that people describe, or two types of learning through communication. There's explicit knowledge, which is knowledge which is documented and written down, or you have a slide deck or whatever for it. And then there's tacit knowledge which sort of individuals know through and they sort of display through their actions, but they don't necessarily they aren't able to necessarily like describe it. So this is why designing and pairing senior designers and junior designers together is so effective, because it's almost like an apprenticeship sometimes. Right. You're able to describe to them some of the heuristics or principles that you're talking about, but then through just action and practice and seeing the other person at work, they're also able to learn some of the more tacit areas. And I feel like in the remote context, we're able, we've got the explicit down, and in fact, we've got the explicit down to the point where there's the issue of balancing signal and noise. Right. But the tacit areas, the areas where you're just like, that person didn't describe to me what I should be doing there, but I've learned something because of the way that they've approached a problem or something like that. Right. When working individually and working remotely, that sort of slips between the cracks. So it's an area that I'm interested in exploring, but I just don't know where to start. So yeah. I wonder, do you have any thoughts on that distinction that I made there?
No, I think you're on the right track. I think GitLab recently did an internship program for engineering. Is that right? I think we recently piloted something. I'd be super interested to hear from those interns. I don't think I was here when they were going through the program, or they were just finishing when I was starting. But I'd love to hear what it was like for them coming in and trying to, one, learn how to work all remote very quickly, because internships tend to be abbreviated. And then also trying to level up their skills while everybody else seemingly maybe is more of a proficient practitioner in their craft. it's rare. I feel like I come across like a junior at GitLab, and I wonder if that's because of the asynchronous approach.
I feel like that's a conscious choice, especially from our organizational setup as well, where our teams are 8 engineers to 1 PM to 1 designer. So I feel like you need some mid-weight designer at the very least in the context of those teams, because you sort of need to be able to handle yourself and pitch your designs in a way where I think junior designers need to learn that in order to become mid-weight designers. But yeah, I think engineers tried it out. I think design, I think, is another one that we need to explore. So we'll see how it goes. On that, with regards to some of the areas that you're excited about around collaboration, areas that you want to sort of broaden your horizons and start to experiment with, are there any areas in particular that you're interested or you're excited about exploring within GitLab?
Yeah, definitely. So something that we recently got approved was to start using more of usertesting.com. So we started getting some seats available to that. I've very heavily relied on the in-person qualitative feedback in the past, because it's usually, well, at least my last company is very easy to get. Most of the apps we were designing were internal. So, it was like shoulder tapping an engineer somewhere, getting their feedback and continuing on, which was super great. The challenge now is with GitLab, because it's a much more scalable product. How do you solicit feedback from a broader audience and do that relatively quickly? It's not as easy to shoulder tap someone that doesn't use your part of the product within GitLab. So then you have to go outside, and recruiting can take a bit to find the right target persona that matches the problem you're trying to solve. And so I'm interested just to see how we can better leverage usertesting.com specifically for unmoderated testing to expedite some of the ideas and workflow solution validation, so that we don't just skip the testing part, but rather that we can get some feedback and maybe even have some of that quantitative measurement of like, were they able to successfully complete this task that we gave them, to better understand like this is the right direction to go. I feel like it can be all too easy just to be like, we know what we're doing. Let's go. Like let's ship something small, which is good. But I think there's also a time and place to sit and just say, let's just quickly test this, even if it takes us a couple extra days. What might that be worth? And Mike had reminded me even that it's not even necessarily about the fact like, oh yeah, this idea is validated or invalidated, but like, what are the learnings that come alongside it? Sometimes those are even hard to quantify. So consider that when you're doing these unmoderated tests. Even if you don't change your design direction at all, you might have learned something along the way, and that in itself is valuable.
Lovely. So we have 2 minutes left. Are there any closing thoughts that you want to leave anyone with?
Yeah, sure. So I think asynchronous collaboration works super great for design. I think some really cool ways that I've seen it are just these threads that we've built within GitLab issues to solicit feedback, and the way that we can carry in designs to and from Figma helps simplify like the workflow for sure. And these tools will only continue to get better over time as users use them more and provide that feedback. So obviously, like if you're using our Figma plugin to work with GitLab, please continue giving us feedback on design management. And likewise, I think GitLab does a really great job in trying to make it a goal and a value for people to grow their remote skill set. I think that's something that my last company didn't focus on at all. It's all very focused on like your technical skill set, which is great. But in order to be effective at remote collaboration, you got to have that asynchronous remote piece a part of your incentive structure. If you don't have that, what's the incentive to change?
Amen, brother. Cool. Well, really appreciate the conversation. It's been great, and have a good
Thanks,
rest
Nick.
of the day.
You too.